Hello and welcome to our daily sketching routine. It is Tuesday, November 26, 2024, and today's topic will be basic elements of drawing. So that's what seemed important to me to go over, both for myself and for anyone else that might benefit. But before we begin, welcome back if you're returning, welcome if you're new. I sketch and post every day, and I use timers, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, to stay focused and build a sketching habit. So I'll start a 10-minute timer. Yeah, yesterday's video was kind of long, almost an hour. And we'll see how this one goes, because there is a lot. And I have ideas. I don't have like a script or an outline. And I will edit out any coughing, which takes a while for me to edit out. That's okay. So yeah, let's just get warmed up, get started. I started a 10-minute timer. So there's a lot of different ideas. I just came up with this specific title, but there's a lot going on here, and I'll have to revisit this topic at other times. So part of this comes from just experience and from what I've seen, and just like what I've learned over the years. Part of it is what I've learned just myself, like what I've experienced, and also well, now because of the internet and everything, then you see more like of people's process and work and stuff like that. So just to be, and I've gone over these basic elements a lot, but they're important because you use them every time you draw. So the main thing, I think, is the word drawing. So when you're drawing, we're talking about line. And I've done videos about this, but at its most basic level, we're talking about line. So there's really no excuse as far as like the entry level or the entry point, because you can use a pencil, you can use a pen, there's paper. So yeah, I feel like anyone can kind of pick up a pen and paper or a pencil and paper, and at its most basic level, line is just dots, bigger dots, longer, and this kind of thing. So that's lines, and it's very similar to writing. So you can just make up writing. There's like a name for this, abstractness. But this is also doodling. So we'll call it marks, we'll call it doodles. And you can be pretty absent-minded about it. And part of why I'm doing this is because, or I'm doing this video, is because I know that some people want to get into art. Maybe you're younger, maybe you're older, like it doesn't really matter. I think part of where I'm coming from is that it's always kind of new to me to do drawing. So I like, maybe that's why people can relate, because I don't assume I know anything. And I don't know if that's just me or what, but like that's just how I am. Like I'm always fascinated by drawing. and also writing for that matter, although my channel is more about drawing and like art, which visual art specifically. So this is a good warm-up, just to doodle and make some marks, but that's what line is. And then if you start to connect some of these doodles, I'm just going to keep it at this zoom level, and I'm just going to draw for a while because kind of have a lot of different ideas I want to go over. Kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but if you connect these lines, then you have shape. So these are like blob shapes that work for foliage. So those are your blob shapes. You've got round shapes. You've got square shapes. So it's not a bad idea to look at reference and just make it simple like this. So you went from like the line and then you just enclose them to make shapes. And then the next thing would be like the form. So you have shape and then form. Again, I have videos about this in the basic drawing playlist. So form only happens because objects have form to them and there's light. Otherwise, everything looks flat. So it's actually like the shadow that gives the form, or the shape its form. I guess that's one way to say it. That's what is happening here when you shade. At its most like basic level, that's what's going on. So now that we kind of looked at like line, shape, form, let's see how they interact. So you can have lines that overlap. So these are still lines. I wouldn't, like, that's not really a shape. That's a line. So lines can overlap in this way. And the more like you have them overlap, the more it looks like it's behind each other. Shapes can overlap. So I kind of did it a little bit there. You can have different kinds of shapes that overlap. Now it might seem really basic, but for some people maybe it's not that basic. Well, it is basic, but maybe it can still be challenging. But also, this is at the heart of every good picture. So shapes can overlap, and then form. So forms can overlap. I'll leave that like right there, but forms can overlap. Like, let's draw like a horse. So I'm going to overlap some forms here. So these are just basic forms. Now we'll go into proportion because there's another thing that I'm doing here, which is the proportion of it. So that's 10 minutes. I'll start another 10-minute timer. Not really sure what a horse looks like, honestly. Kind of like that. So those are overlapping forms. And then as far as, so that's like the basics of that. And then the next thing, so that goes together. And so this is a sketch, like that's what that is. And it's also a drawing, which is, it's a form of sketching, or sketching is a form of drawing. And sketching meaning like preliminary. And I've said it before that you can also do a finished picture in a sketchy style, so it's also a style. So I'll just put also a style. So it's both like a purpose, but it's also a style. It's like a dog horse. The next thing is, so once you kind of get this, and this is pretty fun. I mean, this is just doodling. It's just scribbling. It's sketching. The next thing would be, I think, shading might be a good thing. So I'm kind of going in the order of kind of my experience as far as what I sort of had to figure out or learn or something. And again, a lot of this I had to learn on my own because I didn't have YouTube. So the next thing would be like shading would probably be, and I kind of covered this in yesterday's video. So shading is kind of what I did up here. So when you look at like forms, you'll see that there's like a dark and then like the shadow, and then you'll have like a, stay in camera here, then you'll have like a cast shadow, and so I've talked about how this is kind of the second stage of sketching. So the first one was just sketching it, and then this can still be considered a sketch, but this is like the second stage, which means like the light and the dark is basically light or dark. And so you keep this even just for simplicity. Like you don't start to think about like the smaller shapes just yet. So that's shading. And shading can be just a thicker line on one side, and then you can even just imply like a shadow just by. Now you'll notice the shadow goes in a certain direction, and so that's like perspective, which is coming up. It's a little bit more advanced, but I feel like if you can understand line, and then shape and then form, that's like the start. That's basically, as a kid, that's usually like what you're going to start with. And then or as a beginner. And also, like, even if you're exploring like a different style or something, that's what you're gonna, that's the basics of it. And then what I say, like shading. So the next thing would be like, yeah, like just adding some shading. And you're probably not gonna know, like as a kid, I didn't know about perspective. I just knew like the dark areas, you just kind of added a shadow. I think the next thing would be probably proportion is probably the next thing that you would notice that is off about something. So the next level would be like proportion. So like an example would be this, kind of looks like a dog horse, kind of looks like a dog actually. But yeah, let's play around with that. So the proportion is off, so I'm gonna see if I can get the proportion to be a little bit better. So I'm just gonna kind of work on my proportions here, like since I don't really know the proportion. I'm gonna stretch it out a little bit maybe, and then kind of like this. So this would be like the next kind of step, is to figure out the proportion. And part of it is just like, it's kind of formulaic in the sense that like I could tell you the proportion. I could say, well, it's halfway and that kind of thing, or like a third of the way. Kind of like this. And I'm just kind of eyeballing this. I think I made it too long, didn't I? So this is kind of a formula, and you can look at pictures and figure out the proportion. It looks more like a horse than this. So I just adjusted it, but that's the proportion. So I'm gonna leave it there because that's as much as I know. Now notice I didn't say anatomy. That's actually like, some people sort of, I did too, where you focus on the anatomy, but if your proportions are off, your anatomy's not, it looks even weirder. It looks even more mutated. So notice that I didn't really think about the anatomy. I was just kind of thinking about like the shapes or like the forms, and then I just adjusted the proportion to make it look more like a horse. And if you can understand the proportion, then it'll look correctly as a drawing. Like it might not look correct as like anatomically. If you can get that much, and then like, yeah, like go back to the shading part, then you can get a pretty good drawing. Like just generally speaking, it'll be pretty like convincing. Just to stick with like, again, the same idea. So like just the proportion. So I guess maybe a person is that maybe this tall. I mean, obviously people can be different heights. So we'll make this person. So again, I have kind of my way of doing proportions in the figure drawing and basic drawing. I don't have like specifically for like horses and stuff, because I mean, I don't know exactly how to draw horses, but this is how I would learn. And if you do this, then like you'll remember. So that's 10 minutes. I'll start another 10-minute timer. But yeah, this is like kind of the basic way to do the proportion. So proportion is important to make things look correct. So kind of like that. So proportion with shapes, like the shape. So this is mostly shape with a little bit of the shading to kind of imply like the form, but it's mostly like a shape. Now, this was just from memory. But if I am doing like a study and I wanted to learn how to draw something from memory, I would just use these, like the principles here. I would just break everything down, like the reference or like from life or whatever. I would just think about this. So if I'm looking at like a horse, I might think like, if this is its head, like how long does its neck seem to be? Let's have it like facing forward a little bit. So if that's like the head, so keep in mind like this is still shapes right here, but then I'm going to add some proportion to it. So is it about that long or like longer? And even in a horse, so I'm adding like the, so yeah, even in a horse, there's slight variations. That's kind of how you learn to draw things, and then you can be more precise depending on like the like what you're wanting to draw, like how accurate you want it to be. But you can play around with the proportion. You can play around with like the forms. You can have it be like bigger, because some horses are pretty big. So you can play around with that, but like, so I kind of introduced like the foreshortening here, which is probably the next thing we'll say it is. So yeah, I think once you kind of understand, like, I guess perspective has to do with the idea of the overlap. Like you might actually do this first. You might kind of notice this. But then you might find that like if you need to do foreshortening, which is kind of what I did here, the next thing would be, I'll write it on this side, perspective would probably be the next sort of. It's funny because it's not that this is some kind of rule like set in stone, but it tends to be as you're learning to draw, like what makes the artwork look kind of weak. So for example, if you're drawing like a horse, a lot of times, like if it's facing you, or like a person, we'll just kind of draw some people, you'll notice that like a person that is sort of, let's say, reaching forward. Now, sometimes kids will do this, like they'll draw a hand like big. I mean, this person could even be saying hi, I guess. So sometimes kids will, let me zoom in a little bit, will kind of know to do this. And so that's perspective. It's because this is closer to us. And then if you draw a horse that's like this big, like the same horse shape, you'll know that. So now this is kind of leading into the composition, but like, let's just stick with perspective for now. So let's say you have this. Perspective is what's letting you know that, oh, like let's say you're looking at this in real life, like the horse is a lot smaller than the person, and the hand is just as big as like, or bigger than like the horse is. So that's your perspective. Same with, you could have a house. Kind of like this. So let's say you have a house. Oops. And then you had like a skyline. Then you might think, how is the house bigger than the skyline? And it's because of perspective. And you would know this because you could look at it. You could go outside and see that it's like that. And that's how you would understand like perspective. And we're not even talking about like more advanced perspective. Well, this 10 minutes is starting to wind down. I'll do some more just to kind of wrap up, maybe fill out this page here. So that's like the basic perspective. Call that kind of like visual perspective, meaning it's not based on any kind of rule, it's just based on what you see. And you can actually get away with that for like, you can actually just kind of do that is the thing. It might not, like, you can invent pictures and it'll be kind of like this all the time, but it's not bad. I mean, you can tell a story, you can do an illustration that way, you can draw landscapes that way. You can, for example, now we'll kind of move into composition, but before we even get to that, like, you could just like if you did have like a house, and then like let's say you're outside, like looking at a landscape, you might see like some mountains in the back, you might see some trees, and if you just draw what you see, you'll notice that, yeah, like the house is pretty big. You might see like smoke coming out, and you could just draw the shape of it. And there could be a river, and you might notice that the river kind of looks kind of like this, and just kind of copy the shape. That's 10 minutes. I'll start another one and start to wrap this up. Maybe I'll see if some other idea. So you can just do this and just copy, like if you think, well, the trees are pretty small, like back there, you would be correct. And so you would be doing perspective without knowing like the technical details. But you would be able to draw a picture of it. Now, if you can do all of those things, like you've gone pretty far. Like you can actually draw for a really long time without needing to know anything else. That's the like the basics of drawing. I think the next thing would be, so yeah, I would call that like the basics. You can learn to draw anything in this way. I think maybe like the intermediate level would be, just kind of draw a line right here. I would say like the next level would be understanding, like basically taking the basics, but then the next level of it would be like line quality. And that might not happen until you practice for a while. And then in that way, like your line quality would be like just more definite. So when you're shading, give me something to shade here. So whenever you're shading, it'll look nicer. That's really what it is. Like it'll look more confident. So that might not happen. Like that'll probably improve just by practicing. That'll improve on its own. And you can also kind of make a choice to be more definite. And that's really like what's going on. It just looks more deliberate. The next thing would be just kind of going off of like the basics. So you have like line quality. As far as like shape and form, maybe what could happen, it's sort of like the next thing would be shape. I would stick with like shape and form and make it a little bit more like subtle. So for example, if you're gonna draw like a head, maybe like a basic shape is kind of like this, which is not to say that there's anything wrong with keeping things like drawings looking like basic or simple. There's nothing wrong with that. So you can keep it pretty simple. But I think like the next level of from the basics is just controlling the I guess it goes with like proportion too. Like yeah, controlling like the proportion and like the forms. So if you want to make it like a little more realistic, I would start with kind of the basic of it. So yeah, I think like this next part is really about like being able to manipulate like the form like in the drawing, kind of understanding how to draw more complex kind of forms. and which comes from also understanding the proportion. So keeping it a little bit more realistic, but still stylized. So what's next? What can I talk about next? So the next thing would be shading. So this is sort of the line, shape, form plus proportion is really what this is. Like, that's when you can control like the form, like even more. You can make things look simple, you can make things look more realistic. So then you can, that kind of goes into style, which I'll probably make another video about. I'll be able to cover that. But just to kind of go off of this, so the next thing about shading is understanding like value, so that I'll just kind of use this as an example, so that you might have the basic shading down, but then there's things like reflected light, there's things like a core shadow. That's what that is. That's because of the reflected light. There's things like the cast shadow, which the jawline like affects that. The nose is casting a shadow. So from here, that's what makes things look more realistic, is understanding shading, but like, oh, I have the light like going all over the place. So I messed up the lighting here. So like, that's kind of another thing is, let's say I had light coming from over here, but I made it like there's light. So I'm just gonna, you can leave it at that. And some of this is gonna come from reference. I just have like looked at reference enough to kind of know. So you could get away with this, because then this light could be pretty harsh, that's casting this shadow, and then you have like another light. So what I would do is kind of either leave it, and then it would read as like two kind of light sources. It's good to play around with. If you want to keep it basic, you could just, I mean, even for like a cartoony picture like this, that might be a little too complicated of a shading. That might be too much shading. Also, just even like with cartoons, a lot of times if you have this, like this implies the shadow, like the outline implies like where the light's coming from. You don't really need this thing. But that's what shading is kind of understanding like the value range, so that you know where like the darkest dark is. And depending on the medium that you're using, you can achieve the values in different ways. Like with pen and ink, usually it's like this cross hatching or some kind of like gray color. But that's like the next step in understanding like shading. But you don't always have to have everything fully rendered. Finally, for this video, for the basic elements of drawing, like for perspective, I'll just kind of wrap it up. I'm going to start a 5-minute timer and start to wrap things up. But yeah, I mean, I was able to fill this page just by talking about the basics. So that's something to, if you want something to practice or to sketch or something for ideas, that's just based upon like the basic elements. Finally, for perspective, you have like what I was calling the visual things just kind of look bigger or smaller, which works actually. Like it's not like that's kind of how our eyes work. We don't really think, oh, that's like 1 point perspective. But speaking of that, that's kind of like the next thing is to sort of, and this kind of goes into composition, which maybe is like a level up from that, like maybe more intermediate. But with composition, you kind of start to understand about like the horizon. And so if a person is right here, and like this is which is the eye line basically, but this is for another video. But this would be like the next step up from like the perspective. Like for example, if you're just kind of looking at a person standing there, you might see that, yeah, like there's mountains, there's like some trees, like it's small, like in the back, and the person is like big, and that would be correct. That's perspective. But then if you want to draw it, which is different, well, if you want to invent it, I mean, you could be looking down at the person, so you'll notice that like they're kind of standing like this, like the same person, and you don't really see the mountains, you're just kind of like seeing the ground. You could be looking at this, but usually you're not. Like usually this is because you're drawing, like you want to draw something like this, and so that's perspective. And so the horizon is like, could be up here somewhere, and oops, and there's more to it obviously, but just for the sake of this video, this is the basics of like kind of the basics of perspective, but kind of moving into like the more advanced. So if the horizon's kind of down here, which is the eye level, if the horizon sounds kind of complicated, kind of like this. Again, this could also be, I'm kind of approaching it like not so much theoretical, but like if you were kind of just there kind of looking at this, you might notice that like the person's head is smaller, and that like the mountains and stuff still look pretty small back there. And again, if you just draw like what you see, it would be correct. Like I haven't used any like vanishing points or anything like that, because that's a little bit more advanced. I mean, that took me a little while to get. I don't even get it 100%, honestly. Mainly because, I mean, you have to kind of use it pretty often. I can usually get away with just this. So if you have like, if you just practice this and have an understanding, you can draw a gazillion pictures, really. And if you're not sure how to draw certain things, you can just look it up. But yeah, that's 5 minutes. I'm gonna wrap up this video. It's a lot of information. Hopefully it was helpful. But yeah, thanks for joining me today for our daily sketching routine. And if you like these videos, please support the channel with liking and subscribing, and leaving any comments. And until next time, keep on sketching.